Good morning. Last Sunday after church, a friend and I were talking about the passage that had been read and we'd reflected on, and both of us had worked with in our own ways. An incomprehensibly difficult story of Jesus who says, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you, and don't judge, don't condemn, and a whole lot of stuff. And the next day he sent me a story he found on CNN. Effectively about three people: Tina, her son Ira, and another young man, Jair. Ira was the light of her life. She'd had him when she was 18, she was quite young, and she cared for him and looked after him. And she lived with her mother and brother and Ira in an apartment. On his 35th birthday, a great celebration with friends and family, he was showing the last of the guests out, his cousins. And they were outside the apartment block, just talking before they left, when some hoods came up and the leader decided they were going to rob these four men. Even though they weren't gang people, or they didn't look like they had much. And one said, let's keep going. But he was insistent, persistent and influential. So they held them up and took money, a little bit of money and a phone. And then there were threats and I don't know what else. But the gun was fired, the leader fired, and Ira was shot. And Tina heard the shots and came down and saw her son bleeding out. And she nursed his head in her lap as he died, to stay with him and love him to the end. And in his death, her grief knew no ends. She'd been the light of their lives. It was full of fun and excitement and light and joy, and promised to always be with her, to give her the care that she'd given him. And now he couldn't. The police had no leads and the search went on, but there seemed no hope of finding them. Until a bit over 2 years later, they came and said they'd found the blokes who were responsible for Ira's death. And it went through the whole processes in a court case. Tina appeared at the hearing and spoke from her heart. It was 3 years on and she was softening a little bit, but her grief was still so deep. She spoke of Ira being the light of their lives. She spoke of he's with her every day, that her memory of him and his presence is there. She misses deeply the key in the door, knowing he'll come in with some funny line, the banter between them and between him and his grandma, him lying in bed in the next room texting, "You're making me bacon this morning." A whole lot of feelings and emotions. The leader who shot Ira was sentenced to 30 years, and the other one, Jair, was sentenced to 20 years. Outside the court, feeling some sense of relief that the people who were responsible for her son's death had gotten some punishment, she met up with two women, one she knew from work, and discovered that these were aunts of Jair, the younger one. And they shared some stories with each other, and she said how sorry she was for their loss, that they lost effectively their nephew and that he was now in prison. Anyway, the conversations continued, and at one stage they asked for Jair, would he be able to write her a letter? And she agreed, reluctantly agreed. And he wrote her a most beautiful letter, confessing and apologising and saying, talking a little bit about himself and about his own life, his own really difficult life, his mother who was already quite ill when he was born and who died when he was 14, but in those 14 years it was rough and difficult. They were sometimes kicked out of homes when she was sick, and they slept in the cars, and when she was in hospital for extended stays, he'd live with aunts and others. Life wasn't easy for Jair. And when she died, when he was 14, he'd promised her that he wouldn't unplug any machines at the end. But the doctors had taken her off a respirator, and he felt guilty that he'd killed her. And he just went deep into the streets, into the gangs, and he began selling drugs, heroin, and making money out of it, and the violence, and was consumed by that and totally lost his way. He wasn't violent in himself, but he was caught up in other violence. He didn't really want to rob the boys. He had money in his pocket, but the leader was persistent. He tried to tell Ira to run, but Ira didn't. And this story opened up something in Tina. Tina, who was softening and changing, perhaps her faith, her praying and her faith was transforming her. But she reached out to this boy and listened to his stories and then began talking with him on the phone. And she gave him some motherly advice and said, Jair, you take every opportunity you can in prison. This is a good place for you. It's not a high prison. It's a soft one where you can learn and you'll get opportunities. You take your education and you take all your opportunities. If you embrace the chances that are given you, I will help you. And so Jair did. He threw himself into studies. He studied and got his high school certificate. He then did some university courses in prison. And for his graduation day, graduating with a degree in liberal arts, Tina was invited and she came in. And all these people were there celebrating with Jair. And they were talking to her about, you're Miss Tina. Thank you. You've been so helpful. And she didn't understand how they knew about her. But Jair was talking about her and her wisdom and advice. And they all needed someone like Miss Tina in their lives. And then they finally hugged for the first time. And it felt like her son. He called her mother. And she was feeling guilty that she was doing so much and treating him like her son. But then one night in a dream, Ira came to her in this dream, in this vision, and said, Mum, it's okay. Keep doing what you're doing. This is really good. It's important. And so she supported Jair. And after about 7 years, he came up before a parole hearing. His behaviour was so positive that they were willing to have a hearing. And to the hearing, 30 or 40 people came to bear witness, including Tina. And she told the story again of how her pain and grief was deep and how she hated those who had killed her son. But through the stories of Jair and the work he'd done, she'd forgiven and embraced him and wanted him to have the opportunities in life. She said something profound like, my son Ira died so that Jair, this boy, could find his life. I lost my son, but I'm gaining another one. Anyway, the parole board released him. And when he was released, he came and lived with Tina. She became his mother. And together they formed this foundation in Ira's name that would go out and help young people, young boys, particularly on the streets, people whose lives had been messed up from day one, who needed help and support, who needed the support and love that Tina had given Jair to get them off the streets and give them another chance in life. And as I read this story, I thought, wow, this is deeply profound. Not only for the reading I read last week, but for this week's story, which is called the Transfiguration. It's the week that comes before Lent every year, and we read this story. And in Luke's context, it's a story that comes after Jesus has sent disciples out. And they go out to witness to this love, this grace, this reign of God that they've been experiencing Jesus. But they feel weak and helpless and powerless before the world and its grief and pain and suffering. But the weaker they are and the more vulnerable and humble and the more they surrender themselves into this love of God, things happen through them. And they're surprised. And as they celebrate this, crowds come and listen and he feeds them on the beach. And then he shares with the disciples his own journey ahead. We're going to Jerusalem and I will be arrested, tried, handed over to the powers and crucified. I will die and on the third day rise again. But the disciples haven't got a clue what he's saying and they're confused. And then he takes 3 of them, Peter, James and John, up a mount. And there while he's praying, his face, his appearance is changed. his face glows and his clothes glow. And there in this vision, this experience is Moses and Elijah, these Old Testament key figures. And Jesus is sharing with them about his own departure, his own death and suffering. There in this moment of glorification, he's sharing the story of his own death and struggle. And the disciples are overwhelmed by this, and Peter says, it's good that we're here. Can we build 3 shelters for you, one for you or Moses and Elijah? he doesn't know what he's saying. Maybe it's to hold this experience forever. But then this cloud veils the scene, comes over them, and they're filled with fear and uncertainty. It's reminiscent of Moses on Mount Sinai and other great epiphanic experiences in the Old Testament where it's veiled, where God's presence is veiled because it's too glorifying, too holy, too wondrous. And out of this cloud comes a voice, the voice of heaven, that was there at the baptism that says, "This is my own dear Son, my beloved. With him I'm well pleased. Listen to him." What he's saying is true. This story of death and resurrection that you don't comprehend or understand is true. This suffering will be. And in this moment where there's glory and wonder, where heaven and earth are there is the story of death. The glory, this vision and the reality of death and suffering are held together. And the next day they go down the mountain, and there in the valley, life as it is revealed again. The disciples that are left there are struggling with this father and son. This son is overwhelmed by what he calls an evil spirit who throws him into epileptic fits, and the disciples don't know what to do or how to help him. They feel helpless and powerless. And Jesus comes in and prays over the situation and brings healing and release. And I hear in these stories this holding together, this joy and the suffering and the pain of life held together. That in the midst of our suffering, in the midst of our pain, there is life. There is God. That in the midst of the glory and the wonder, there is a reality of life, and they're held together. And in our deepest, darkest valleys of the shadow of death, God is present to sustain us and hold us and lead us through and bring transformation to us and to the world around. Just as he did to Tina. In the midst of her deep grief and pain and suffering, he brought new life. In the death of her son, he brought the resurrection, if you like, of Jair, of new life to this young man who'd lost it, who was dead and lost in this world. And that's the way of God in our lives. When we feel helpless and powerless before the world, when we surrender into that powerlessness and offer it to God, we find a new strength. We find things that can happen that we didn't imagine. Life can be transformed into a new thing. And we need this hope, we need this life, we need this way in the world as it is. The stories we're hearing coming out of the US are troublesome and difficult and horrible. Of Trump and this band of oligarchs, of billionaires who are sacking people by the thousand. Medicaid and other services and programs that help particularly the poor and the most marginalised people. And those people on the margins are being pushed further and further away and losing what help and support they have. Immigrants and refugees are being cast out, and people overseas are not receiving the foreign aid that they need. People are dying because of these policies. We need to stand up in the midst of the grief and the pain of the world, in our weakness and vulnerability, in our helplessness, in our powerlessness, and recognise before God that we don't have the power to change. But God's love and grace can make a difference, can transform us and transform our world. Only if we believe in this way of love and come together and join our voices to one another and become a voice for strength, for hope, for life, for justice in our world. And trust in this God who can bring it all together and can bring hope, as he did through Tina with this young man, Jair. Will you join in this way of Jesus?